Welcome to Other Hazards Training for Field Technicians and Sales. Course Overview. The purpose of the course is to provide a general awareness of other hazards in the work environment. After completion of this training, employees should know and understand TKE lead program, the hazards associated with environmental asbestos, TKE policy on working with PACM/ACM, TKE bloodborne pathogens program, and the TKE stance on mercury abatement. Lead is a persistent toxic substance that can pose a serious health risk to our employees. Because of that, TKE employees are directed not to perform activities on materials or surfaces that may or do contain lead. This includes disturbance of adjacent surfaces through activities such as hot work, cutting, burning, welding, grinding, or sandblasting. TKE employees are not trained for lead removal, disturbance, or disposal. Potential exposure activities. Operations that can generate exposure during elevator/escalator maintenance/installation include welding, torch cutting on lead-coated metals or adjacent to lead-containing surfaces, sanding, grinding surfaces of lead-coated materials, electrical, maintenance and repair to lead wiring and connections. Note: these operations shall have much higher potential for LED exposure and alterations and repairs in smaller areas with poor ventilation/air exchange, such as an elevator hoistway. Lead program. Notification requirements. Building owners are required to advise of lead-containing materials at their facility. There are possibly some state regulations. Many facilities may have data to show lead-containing material, and this may only require a request of any such information. Coatings on metals before 1978 are suspect to contain lead. Local management/supervisor shall investigate any activity that disturbs potential lead-containing materials. Collecting of samples, paint or other coatings, shall be performed by a licensed lead consultant to determine if materials contain lead. All field employees shall have at a minimum, lead awareness training annually to include familiar with OSHA 1926.62 lead standards. Types of potential exposure conditions. Purpose of possible medical/environmental surveillance. Familiarity with compliance plan, when required. Activities and products that may result in lead exposure. Note: this is for LED awareness. As stated in the company policy, employees are prohibited from performing activities that will disturb LED. Specialty subcontractors shall be utilized, if disturbance is required. Environmental asbestos. Employees shall not perform any construction, maintenance, or repairs in areas where there is a potential exposure to a presumed asbestos-containing material, PACM, asbestos-containing material, ACM, or in regulated areas in the normal scope of their work. TKE employees will not drill doors with PACM/ACM. Exceptions must be approved by your regional safety team. If any employee is asked to enter such areas, they will contact their supervisor. TKE employees are not asbestos abatement contractors. Notification requirements. Building owners are required to notify TKE of any PACM or ACM located in their buildings. After receipt of this notification, if TKE chooses to submit a bid, they shall be prepared with the following. Employees trained in asbestos awareness. Make the building owner aware that TKE employees will not disturb or abate any ACM or PACM. Asbestos investigation guidelines. In the event a PACM is identified in an area where we are performing work, please follow the steps set out below to ensure the health and safety of our employees. Identification of PACM. Employee who identifies a PACM should notify his/her supervisor immediately, and any work in the area is to be suspended. Investigation of PACM and notification to building owner. A qualified local manager or supervisor shall inspect the area in question to determine if potential exposure exists. Once potential exposure is confirmed, the local manager or supervisor shall meet with an authorized representative of the customer/building owner to request documentation that the questionable material is or is not an ACM. The documentation shall include verification that the area has been tested in accordance with all OSHA guidelines and that the levels, if any, are below the permissible exposure limit, PEL. If the building owner provides test results, email them to the Director of Health and Safety for review. If the material is ACM and exposure levels are above the PEL, The superintendent, operations manager, or owner shall post signs and notify employees that they are not to disturb the area containing asbestos. If the building owner is unable to produce documentation that the area is free of asbestos, the local manager shall notify the building owner that testing and air monitoring will be required. Note: if test results reveal ACM, air monitoring shall be performed. If monitoring reveals levels above PEL, work in the area will not proceed until ACM is abated. Have building owner sign for their copy of the PACM evaluation form. Sample removal. If a building owner fails to provide documentation of testing, or refuses to test PACM in accordance with our request, then a proper consultant shall be called to perform sampling. Test results shall be sent to the Director of Health and Safety for review. Test results. If test results reveal no exposure, or levels lower than those permissible under OSHA guidelines, the Director of Health and Safety will notify the supervisor that the job is cleared and that work can continue. If test results reveal levels above the permissible levels per OSHA guidelines, the Director of Health and Safety will notify the local manager and building owner, and service shall be suspended until cleanup has occurred and the area is safe for our employees. Once the job site has been cleared and or levels are below the permissible guidelines, the local manager shall make the test results available in the office and at the job site. All field employees and sales employees shall attend an asbestos awareness course at least annually. Training for Class 4 workers, maintenance and custodial activities during which employees contact but do not disturb ACM or PACM activities to clean up dust, waste, and debris resulting from Class 1, 2, and 3 activities, shall focus on the potential locations of asbestos, and ways to recognize damage or deterioration and avoid exposure. General training shall include TKE procedures for dealing with ACM, ways to recognize asbestos, adverse health effects of asbestos exposure, the relationship between smoking and asbestos in causing lung cancer, operations that could result in asbestos exposure and the importance of protective controls to minimize exposure, the purpose, proper use, fitting instruction, and limitations of respirators, the appropriate work practices for performing jobs around asbestos, medical surveillance program requirements, when and where to use wet methods and HEPA vacuums, the contents of the asbestos standard. Safe work practices. Buildings built before 1980 shall be presumed by employees to contain asbestos, unless the building owner certifies them asbestos-free. Using information provided by the employer, employees shall recognize any ACMs or PACMs and avoid them at all times. Employees will not, under any circumstances, intentionally disturb an ACM or PACM that will create an exposure above the PEL. If an accidental disturbance occurs that may exceed the PEL, the employee shall immediately vacate the site until the asbestos can be removed and contact their supervisor. Sampling. If a supervisor determines the need to sample material to determine the presence of asbestos, notify the local manager to make necessary arrangements with a licensed consultant. Monitoring. Monitoring shall be done by a qualified person. Air samples shall be monitored in accordance with OSHA requirements for PELs and ELs. Record keeping. Objective data records. WRTCA uses objective data to demonstrate that products made from ore containing asbestos cannot release fibers in concentrations at or above the PEL or short-term exposure limit, STEL. They shall keep an accurate record for as long as it is relied on. Monitoring records. All records of all employee exposure monitoring shall be maintained for at least 30 years and made available to the affected employees, former employees, their designated representative, and/or OSHA's assistant secretary when requested. Medical surveillance records. All records shall be maintained for the duration of the employee's employment plus 30 years and made available to the subject employee or anyone having written consent of that employee and/or OSHA's assistant secretary. Other record keeping. All other records shall be maintained for 1 year beyond the last date of employment for each employee. Bloodborne pathogens. This written policy is designed to eliminate any on-the-job exposure to potentially infectious body fluids that may cause disease. Very seldom will exposure incidents cause the disease. All employees shall be required to have a basic understanding of the policy and follow the required safe working practices as dictated by TCA and OSHA. TKE employees are not in an at-risk position for exposure to bloodborne pathogens simply due to the nature of their work. All employees trained in first aid do not render first aid as a primary job, and first aid rendering is done as a collateral duty. This does not eliminate the possibility of exposure due to an unforeseen accident while at work. Definitions: bloodborne pathogen, pathogenic microorganisms that are present in human blood and can cause disease in humans. Contaminated, the presence, or the reasonably anticipated presence, of blood, or other potentially infectious materials on an item or surface. Decontamination, the use of physical or chemical means to remove, inactivate, or destroy bloodborne pathogens on a surface or item, to the point where they are no longer capable of transmitting infectious particles and the surface or item is rendered safe for handling, use, or disposal. Exposure incident, a specific eye, mouth, other mucous membrane, or non-intact skin contact with blood, or other potentially infectious materials. HBV, hepatitis B virus. HIV-human immunodeficiency virus. Definitions continued. Potentially infectious material, human body fluids, and unfixed tissues or organs from a human, living or dead, or cell or tissue cultures. Source: individual, any individual, living or dead, whose blood or other potentially infectious materials may be a source of exposure. Safe work practices. Be alert in high-risk areas where syringes and sharps may be used. Universal precautions shall be observed to prevent contact with blood or other potentially infectious materials. Under circumstances in which differentiation between body fluid types is difficult or impossible to identify, all body fluids shall be considered potentially infectious materials. Work sites shall be maintained in a clean and sanitary condition. All broken glass and potentially sharp instruments shall be cleaned up using a broom and dustpan. Do not touch these materials with your hands. When there is reason to believe that a surface has been contaminated with a blood or other potentially infectious material, it shall only be cleaned by the source individual. When the source individual is not available, the contaminated area shall be avoided until a qualified person using the proper barriers and cleaning solvents have decontaminated it. All accidents shall be reported to the supervisor. During this reporting process, indicate whether blood was or was not present and if a potential exposure did occur. A bloodborne pathogen kit shall be provided as needed. Note: if an actual exposure incident as defined above has occurred, special requirements shall be followed. Immediately following an exposure incident, contact the regional manager and workers' compensation administrator for the proper procedures. Note: if surfaces have been contaminated with urine or other non-blood containing bodily fluids, necessary precautions shall be taken to prevent contact with contaminated materials. Hospitals. Occasionally, while performing work on elevators and escalators located in a healthcare facility, mechanics may come across potentially hazardous materials. In these instances, immediately notify your supervisor. In no way shall an employee place themselves in a potentially hazardous position in dealing with hazardous materials in a healthcare facility. Escalators. In some cases, escalator mechanics may find themselves facing potentially hazardous materials in and around the escalator pit. If materials are found, contact your supervisor and have the area properly decontaminated before performing any housekeeping in the area. Fiber optics. When working with fiber optics, all employees performing any splicing or termination activities shall wear safety glasses with side shields. Any other employees or site managers entering the work area shall wear safety glasses with side shields also. Unless an employee is absolutely sure there is not a light source at the other end, they should never look directly into the end of the cable. A power meter can be used to make certain the fiber is dark. While working with fiber optics, the worker needs a well-ventilated and well-lit work area. Workers shall not smoke while working with fiber optics. All food and beverages shall be kept out of the work area. Workers can wear disposable aprons to keep fiber particles off their clothing. Before leaving the work area, an employee should always check their clothing for pieces of stray fiber, and if any are found, they can remove it with double-sided tape. Fiber optics. All workers should wash their hands thoroughly before touching their eyes, and contact lens wearers should wash their hands before touching their lenses. Workers shall read all instructional material before handling chemicals. A disposable container that can be tightly closed must be used for fiber scraps. When finished with a fiber optic job, all cut fiber pieces shall be disposed of properly along with any used chemicals and containers. The work area shall be thoroughly cleaned when job is completed. Following these simple fiber optic safety rules can keep workers healthy and the work environment safe for all employees. Mercury abatement. Due to environmental and health issues surrounding mercury, and the availability of solid-state relays, any mercury-containing relays shall be regarded as obsolete. Any TKE employee that encounters or knows of mercury-containing relays shall immediately report this to their supervisor. These cases fall under the obsolescence clause and shall be followed up with a proposal to have them changed to solid-state relays. A risk of mercury spill and contamination exists only if the relay is dropped and breaks. Take extra precautions to avoid dropping the relay when removing. Place the mercury-containing relay into a hazmat bag and send to a local environmental company for safe disposal. Thank you for completing Other Hazards training.